Welcome to SEC Football Live here on the 440 Sports Network. My name is Braden Gall. You can get to me on twitter.com at Braden Gall.
And I'm Stephen Lassan. You can also get to me on twitter.com at AthlonSteven and Stephen L. CFB on Facebook and Instagram.
So the SEC is closing in on a contract with Netflix to do a documentary, all-access documentary a la Drive to Survive for F1, Full Swing for the PGA Tour. Netflix guys right now, definitely not the Manziel documentary or the Swamp Kings documentary, not that style of like, we're going to pay Urban Meyer a ton of money to sit here and lie to you about everything. No, like a real all-access documentary, which frankly added a ton of interest to PGA Tour golf and to F1. And for the SEC to sign this kind of contract, Stephen, would be a huge access point. I think one of the reasons I think that they're doing this, not because they need the exposure, Stephen, but honestly, I think they know that these coaches know that these players are going to get paid to do interviews and be sort of, we can go pay, this show right now could go pay a player every week to come do an interview with us. So they're starting to lose control of access. And if you're going to lose control of access, you might as well let it help you in recruiting. And I think that the rules are going to be SEC teams can opt in or opt out of this if they want to. Georgia's already rumored to be maybe in on this. How much access remains to be seen. Today on the show, I want to ask you, who are the biggest characters and the best documentary-focused storylines in the conference in the SEC? But honestly, I think what's fascinating is if I'm Lane Kiffin and I'm Ole Miss, I am absolutely using this. I'm going on it. I'm going to put everything I've got on there, even if we lose some games and don't accomplish our goals, because I'm going to use it in recruiting. Come play for me. I put you on Netflix where there's 100 million subscribers.
Absolutely. I think there's a couple different factors here. I think number one, if Georgia lays down the gauntlet and says they're in, you better bet that if you're Alabama, you're Texas, you're one of these other teams, you want to be involved too, because you're going to be fighting for them for recruits. So it's obviously, hey, they're getting this extra exposure on this high profile show. We need to get in front of this as well. It's good for recruiting. But also I think just for like NIL purposes of your current roster retention, it could help you sell through the transfer portal. So there's a lot to it, but I think there's a lot of selling opportunities here for these coaches and for teams. And I think there's really no downside unless you're just worried about losing some sort of state secrets that you have behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good thing. And I think it's probably more likely that a lot of these teams are going to be willing to be in on this.
I cover the Tennessee Titans. I am at Titans practice every single camp and every single year. And somehow, some way, they still have figured out ways to win and lose football games on their own. So it's not because you give access to people. So I'll be fascinated to see what happens, how much access there actually is on this, and which teams eventually sign up. I agree. If Georgia says yes, does that put some pressure on Kalen DeBoer? Does that put some pressure on Brian Kelly? Does that put some pressure on Mike Elko, some of these bigger brands to be out there and in front of their fans, Steve Sarkisian, Brent Venables, etc. So we're going to go through some coaches and some teams and some players and pick out some of the best storylines that we think we would love to see on a documentary setting like what Netflix is going to do. Let's get to SEC storylines here, Stephen. So I think there's one coach above all coaches that is more interesting than every coach, and it is not the one that is in your brain right now, dear listener, and dear Stephen Lassan. I think everyone thinks it's Lane Kiffin. It's not. The most interesting coach in the conference, in my opinion, that would make for the most interesting documentary is Hugh Freeze.
Yes, of course it is. I mean, honestly, I think this is the hard part about the SEC. I tried to sort of rank just a couple to see and sort of come up with a cutoff line. You can't. There's so many interesting storylines, 1 to 16, but I think Freeze would be near the top of my list for a lot of reasons. Obviously, he's a very interesting personality. You also have Auburn trying to improve this season after a pretty dismal finish to last year. The recruiting's gone better. What can they do in his second season? I think just the whole off the field thing would be interesting to track in something like this. So, yes, Hugh Freeze would be near the top of my list. I didn't expect you to go Freeze too. At the top of your list. I actually wondered if you might have thrown me a curveball and went with Eli Drinkowitz at one, because I do think there's a lot to be excited about Missouri with the returning team. I think Drinkowitz is a pretty interesting personality. He is not afraid to mix it up, and they're going to be
True.
pretty good this year.
True.
So they could be really just from a viewership standpoint, just fascinating.
I think Missouri as a team is interesting. And if you gave me Brady Cook with Luther Burden and Eli Drinkowitz, those three sort of offensive people working together each week, I think that would be an incredible documentary. I agree. And I think Eli is more entertaining than you realize. Here's the
Yep.
reason, because I think Kiffin's number 2. But honestly, I think Ole Miss as a team, Ole Miss to me is maybe the most interesting team in all of college football. It might, other than, I guess, if you want to put Colorado on there for all the stupid reasons that Colorado is interesting, like Ole Miss from a structural standpoint, from a strategic standpoint, from a is college football actually changing standpoint. You've got interesting personalities on both the offense and the defense. You got 5-star kids, you got transfer kids, you got a great quarterback. I mean, all these things for Ole Miss. Like, can you rent a championship team? Ole Miss has never done it before, so you have that element, which is more interesting than Georgia or LSU or anybody else. I think Ole Miss is maybe the most interesting team in all of college football from a documentary standpoint. The problem with Lane Kiffin is that he is not the personality that everyone thinks he is on Twitter. He's the personality that is closest to Lane Kiffin. And I've talked to former players about this, like players that played for him recently. Like, he's just not the thing that you see on Twitter. We've told you this before. The thing that is closest to the real Lane Kiffin is like his 8-minute SEC Media Days opening speech, where he's just up there and he's like, we got some players and there's like a quarterback. And then, like, yeah, I got a dog this offseason. And, my son is going to be in high school this year. And so, we'd like to score some more points. Like, that's how he is. He's just, and that maybe is why he's got the personality to handle the portal stuff. But like, I don't think he's as interesting a documentary character as people think he is.
Is that an act? So, I
No,
mean,
no, he is a quirky, weird, quiet dude.
it,
He is not the blast you on Twitter guy. That's not what he is.
a documentary on following Juice Kiffin all season might be interesting if you're,
He's
if you're
overexposed. He's
True.
overexposed.
I think for all the reasons you said there, the transfers, sort of the ingredients coming together for Ole Miss this season, and our coach scouting, it mentioned, can you win a championship? They've had double-digit win seasons, I think 2 of the last 3 years. There's a lot of pressure too, I think, on Ole Miss too, because there's going to be a handful of these guys this year that are going to move on. So you're going to have to try and reinvent this again next season. So I think the pursuit of the SEC championship, that Ole Miss has
Yep.
super high expectations.
Yep.
They are picked in our Athlon's top 5. They're projected to make the playoff. All of that, the expectations, the weight of the season, the transfers, Jackson Dart coming back as one of the top quarterbacks in the country. Ole Miss, you could, without a doubt, I have no doubt you could fill 60 minutes every week with just Ole Miss. They are
Yep.
very high on my list of must-see teams for this.
So who's your number 1 coach?
I'd probably Kiffin,
Kiffin.
honestly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I had a tough. So Ole Miss is my number 1 team. Freeze is my number 1 coach. I think there's a clear-cut number 1 player though, and we have not said his team or coach or anything about this program all show. I think the most interesting player in the conference is Nico Iamaleava. I think he is, if you want to go star power, big brand, unusual story, you got the background of the NCAA investigation, you got all this stuff, like the hope and savior of a program for 25 years. Like, he also could be good enough to make for great television. And we know he's a personality. So I think Nico is number 1. I think Freeze is the number 1 coach. I think Ole Miss is the number 1 team. I think Alabama and Texas might be number 2 in every category.
But also, I think when you said the most interesting player, I can't disagree with you on Nico for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. I mean, you've got a quarterback like every sentence that you start, Tennessee can make the playoff if Nico is good. It has nothing to
Right.
do with the defense. It's all on Nico in a first-year starter. Very realistic that it could happen because Tennessee's offense really wasn't that great last year in SEC games. You look at the scoring, it wasn't great.
Yeah.
They've upgraded at quarterback by going to somebody who has 1 career start. I actually might go with Jalen Milroe as maybe the most interesting player here because he's going to be one of the leaders of this transition from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer. And we saw what Kalen DeBoer did at Washington with Michael Penix. First year, obviously they had a tie at Indiana. He was good in his first year, even better in his second year. So I think how Jalen Milroe helps to bridge the two coaching tenures, but also how he evolves in this system because he is going to have to be a little bit better, well rounded as a passer. And how does DeBoer help him get there? So, very broadly, Alabama is just fascinating because of the turnover. But I would love to watch something on Jalen Milroe and his leadership of this
Yeah.
transition.
No, I think it is hard to sort of gauge where Alabama belongs in all of this because Kalen DeBoer is interesting. I think he's going to be more interesting than Nick Saban, frankly, as a personality type. I think Jalen Milroe is utterly fascinating. I think he's underrated as a college quarterback. I think a lot of people like he's like a joke, and it's like, why? I don't like he was great. And then as a team, replacing Nick Saban has to be one of the most. I mean, if you're making a
Yeah.
documentary in the SEC, there's no way that Alabama wouldn't be like heavily featured in a documentary setting if you could get them. Do I think that that's the most interesting thing? I don't know. I'm torn on Alabama. Um, I think the more interesting combination of everything, and this is sort of other than maybe Ole Miss, is Texas. Like, what do you need to make a great story? Well, you need personality, you need skill, you need talent, you need drama, you need some adversity, you need sort of championship level expectation. And honestly, I want to see like nerdy football stuff. And Steve Sarkisian would deliver that in spades. So you're going to have like this historical Texas thing. You're going to create an enemy because most everybody hates Texas that's not a Texas fan. And I honestly think if you ask me, because I'm with you, Nico and Milroe are the top two most interesting characters on the field in the SEC. I think you could argue Arch Manning is number 3 in the entire conference. And to say that you've got a Quinn Ewers Arch Manning storyline you can put on television is gold if you are Netflix. So and honestly, if you could package Oklahoma and Texas together, and you could do a Texas Oklahoma first trip through the SEC starting in media days in Dallas, which by the way are coming up in like a couple of weeks. And you could tell the whole Texas Oklahoma story through the lens of both of their experiences coming into the league. I think that would be extraordinary television. But I think Texas is one of the few programs because Georgia's all that stuff too, but they're just kind of boring. Texas has this adversity thing. Like people hate them, and Arch Manning's the backup, and people kind of doubt the program. And oh, you're joining the SEC for the first time. Texas is must see television. Must see television.
It's weird to think about this, but Arch Manning probably has more of a pool for this than maybe Quinn Ewers would. Like
Yes.
Quinn Ewers is really good. That's the funny thing is that he could be a preseason All-American this year. And there's a lot of intrigue about the Texas offense because of the new weapons. So you could see some offseason details how Ewers is growing with Isaiah Bond or Silas Bolden or Matthew Golden or whoever. So it is interesting that Arch Manning would probably draw more of a crowd. But
Crazy.
overall, yeah, Texas and Oklahoma. I would love to watch 60 minutes of Bill Bedenbaugh, the offensive line coach for Oklahoma, just getting after the offensive line in the fall, trying to develop this group as they go into the SEC. I'm going to throw you a wild card here. Arkansas, Bobby Petrino coaching the offense every week during the season. Like we've joked about before, reminding Hunter Yurachek every week he was the head coach here at some point in the past. They don't want to talk about how it ended. But Petrino and just I think Sam Pittman, I think, is probably one of the more well-liked coaches in college
Yeah.
football. Something like this, I think his personality and the Petrino storyline would be fascinating.
No, I mean Shane. If the if you had to rank 3 coaches that are most on the hot seat, it probably is Sam Pittman 1, Billy Napier 2, and then maybe I don't know Clark Lee or Shane Beamer. There's probably not. It's probably just those top 2.
Probably a gap after those two.
But
Yeah.
if you give me, I mean, honestly, Pittman, Napier, and Beamer, like those are 2 elite personalities, and Billy Napier.
Yeah.
But Florida's fascinating. You
Yeah.
change your entire defensive coaching staff. You've got a true freshman quarterback you're going to play. You got Graham Mertz, who's like resurrected his career. He's on the hot seat as a coach. Like, and Florida's a big brand. So, like you mentioned, Bobby Petrino coaching at Arkansas, and it wasn't even like a top 4 or 5 storyline. And that's the same thing with Florida. Like this is so Mark Stoops almost left Kentucky, and there's rumors he could retire. That's a huge story. Tennessee, haven't even mentioned Josh Heupel or the Tennessee team. We just talked about Nico. Like LSU. Here's the other thing. I think it is a huge compliment, and I think it is a good thing for LSU and Texas A&M that they're not anywhere near these lists. Do you follow what I'm saying there? I think Texas A&M has been near this list too many times. it it needs a calm, quiet, put your head down and go to work season. I think that's what Mike Elko is going to do. LSU just also utterly fascinating, but like I don't know what is fascinating about LSU yet. I don't know.
I guess maybe to look at it from a different angle, that's what also could make them interesting is Mike Elko coming in and sort of doing a reverse of everything that Jimbo Fisher did.
Yeah.
And I think something you said about Mike Elko has always stuck with me is that very much a blue collar kind of hardworking coach, not going to worry about fake plaques about national championships. He's not going to talk the talk. He's going to let the play on the field do the talking.
Yeah.
And I think that the storyline of him trying to get A&M back to top 25 consideration would be one I would watch. Also LSU's defensive staff this year, Bo Davis and Blake Baker and Harold Perkins trying to get this defense better.
Yep.
I also just two wild cards here. And I guess this is the problem with the SEC is there are so many interesting storylines, particularly at quarterback. Kentucky, Mark Stoops, after taking the A&M job for like 10 minutes last season, hiring Bush Hampton as offensive coordinator, Brock Vandegrift first year. That trio.
That's more of a nerdy one for sure.
All right. Sure. And I'm going super nerdy. Jeff Lebby at Mississippi State, because there's only 2 returning starters. There's a ton of new, and it'd be perfect. It's a perfect opportunity for him to showcase this program.
He might be the only person less interesting than Jeff Lebby, Mississippi State might be Vanderbilt and Clark Lee. Although Diego Pavia might be more interesting.
Yes.
Here's the other thing. There's better defensive player intrigue, I think, in the SEC. No surprise there. But if you're giving me, you already mentioned Walter Nolan, Deion Walker is a fascinating personality. Harold Perkins is fascinating. Malachi Starks is a fascinating personality. James Pierce is a big time playmaker, could be the number 1 overall pick for Tennessee along the defensive line. Like you look at the defensive star power in the SEC, there's no Jadeveon Clowney or Will Anderson yet, but I think there are some names that could become that by the end of the season. There's some really big time defensive names. I still don't think any of them come close to like what you would get out of if you could give me a Jackson Dart, Carson Beck, Brady Cook like documentary, that would be incredible. If you could then do the young upstart guys, right? Like Connor Wigman, Garrett Nussmeier, Nico, Jackson Arnold as a documentary, like put those guys together in a group. None of those other players would come close to the quarterbacks. But I do think that there are some defensive players that I would, from a nerd standpoint, I would follow around on a documentary series this year for sure. So
I think the theme of the SEC this season, like I said, is great quarterbacks. And I think that to me would be just on its own enough of a storyline. But also, if you're looking just for 2 sort of under the radar defensive players, what about Landon Jackson in Arkansas? Made a huge jump from 2022 2023. And also Malachi Moore, the safety from Alabama. Mentioned Milroe as part of that transition group. Malachi Moore is the only returning starter in Alabama secondary. That's a group that's under a lot of pressure this season. And he's a senior looking to improve his draft stock for next season.
Yeah, I think Luther Burden is probably the most interesting non-quarterback in the conference, though. I think.
Yes, I would agree with that.
We don't have a lot of like Leonard Fournette running backs in this league. Like
ETN's the for sure like first team pick this year.
Yeah.
But after that, you get like Montrell Johnson, Jarquez Hunter, a bunch of like solid and breakout proven capable candidates, I guess.
Yeah, no question. No Division II walk-on going to lead the league in rushing this year.
Probably not.
We'll see. All right, there are your SEC storylines, coaches, players, and teams. Come on, Netflix, get the job done. Come on, man.